show you that we're live as of right now. We'll just wait a couple minutes just to get people on the stream.
Okay.
And then start. There's also a 10-second delay, so that's why.
Gotcha.
We have 2 countries watching today, so that's kind of cool.
Oh.
Hey. I'm gonna give it another minute. Okay, start. Hey everybody, and welcome to Empowered. This is a live series where we'll be discussing a variety of episodes and topics. This week we have a very, very special interview for you guys. It's the One Pal team from our neighbors south of the border. So I'm very excited to have you guys here today discussing mental health and, just the idea surrounding why it's so prevalent in South Asian communities. So I think it's a topic that doesn't have a lot of people advocating for. So this is great that you guys are doing this. I want to just let you guys introduce yourselves to our viewers, and then we'll go from there.
All right. So, hey, everybody. I'm Sid. I'm one of the co-founders of One Pal. My day job, I'm a 23-year-old software engineer from Mountain View, California.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tiffany. I am 24 years old, and I live in Oakland, California. I am a chemical engineer by trade, and I work in research and development. Something Sid and I did want to mention, just because we are talking about mental health, which can be a sensitive topic. As you can see from our bios, both of us are engineers. So we aren't necessarily mental health professionals, and we aren't here to give medical advice. Like, obviously, go to your doctors for that. But we are South Asians, and we do have our own lived experiences, and we've done research. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, I think it's great that you mentioned that you're just advocating for something that you hold really close to your heart, and that taking the information that you give to everyone today, taking the time to sit down with that information and go from there rather than just listening to you and acting on that. So I think that's really important that you already told that to everybody. So One Pal, tell me how that came about. Was there something in specific that triggered your interest with mental health, and especially with South Asians?
Yeah, so I think for some starting context, and also I guess a fun fact, Sid and I actually went to the same undergraduate institution as well as the same high school. And both of those institutions actually had a large percentage of South Asians. So while we both grew up in America and went to school in America, we actually were surrounded by South Asians growing up. And I think we got to experience firsthand the influence that South Asian culture can have in an academic setting. So I think that's initially where our interest started.
And I'd like to add to that with all this sort of at the back of our minds as well, there was also, at least for me, a very specific catalyst, which is a few years ago, and this is after we had graduated and Tiffany and I were both in college. We got the news that a freshman actually at our high school, had taken his own life. And that was, while I'd heard about that in, say, other areas and all, had hit close to home then. And I knew what the situation was like, having attended that school and having been in that community before. And just the event itself was somewhat of a catalyst to get the ball rolling on some kind of discussion about this. But what really made me want to do this in the way that we're doing it now is how the community reacted after that. So, of course, there was some discussion around this, both at the school and within the community. But what I did see is that a lot of the reactions weren't necessarily positive. They weren't exactly heading in what I thought would be the right direction. And to be quite frank, there was a great deal of even misinformation floating around. And of course, that comes from somewhere and from some ideas. And we want to make sure that folks get the right ideas when they're talking about mental health.
Yeah, and I think that's so important that you mentioned misinformation in the sense that like we see all this information, you know, from different like blogs, and we start reading those and use those as reliable sources. So I think it's great that you've used, you know, different avenues and different aspects to, you know, collect that information and present it in the way that you have. Now, I know for me, being on an organization, we have a certain vision that we try and curate through our different projects. So is there a certain like outlook that you have for this organization, or a certain vision?
Right. So what I think our mission is we want to be focused on mental health education, on giving people the right facts, giving them the right tools that they need, and we want to do this through through scientific research based like backing to all of these things. So while of course there are some organizations that may talk about just mental health in general, they may not necessarily be very convincing unless they have some sort of scientific backing around them. Like we respect, you know, medical doctors, so there's like some motivation to us respecting mental health professionals that act in the same way. And the fact is that a lot of this information is out there, right? It exists in academic journals. It exists in the minds of mental health professionals and researchers, but it isn't necessarily very readily accessible and digestible that everyone knows about it. So we hope to bridge that gap between, say, things like academic research on this topic and the wide variety of people that can benefit from this.
Yeah, and I think to expand on that, when we were first initially just brainstorming and talking about what One PAL could be, we did our due diligence and looked into different organizations and Googled things. And I think a theme that we saw is that there were educational-based nonprofits that speak about raising awareness about mental health, but in those organizations, while they're doing amazing work, they didn't necessarily address our culture. So like we as South Asians know that there's things unique to our culture. So we saw that. And then we also found organizations that may directly address South Asian culture, but didn't really do it with an educational backing. So to us, we saw this kind of white space to really, really talk about academic backed research within South Asian cultures.
Yeah, I think the fact that you're using science-based, you know, research to support what you're trying to relay and the message that you relay is in itself so important. I know reading scientific journals isn't a joke, and especially not if it's not what you're studying. I don't think you've ever taken a bio course in your engineering degree. So kudos to you guys for, you know, using real information and presenting it in a way that's accessible for everybody. So I want to talk about in different aspects of your nonprofit in itself. So what are some ways that you're helping people through your platform?
Okay, so I think the first primary thing that we want to do is to at least give people that may be in need of this information that, hey, first of all, they're not alone. And second of all, we want to give them the resources such that they can take the next step, which is some way that they can positively better themselves.
Okay. So basically you're going to present this information, and, you know, people are going to use the education that you're relaying to them to help them not only understand, but also kind of explain to other people why they need the help that they need and why they need the resources like yourself to, you know, help better themselves. So I think that in itself is awesome. So again, I run an organization as well, so I know that like you have so many goals in the back of your mind, but just executing that and planning that is difficult at times. So an organization like yourself, who's still in, you know, the baby stages of development, what are some of your goals moving forward with your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we definitely are in the earlier stages, like you mentioned. I think first and foremost, we really just want to expand our content that is available on the website. So currently we have articles that are easily digestible, but summarize academic research. And then we also have this really awesome series called Talks with Professionals, where we interview mental health professionals and ask them questions, specific questions that you would learn in your field of study if you were a mental health professional. Mm-hmm. And then in the future, we want to expand into translating some of that content into South Asian languages. And I think that's, again, touching on accessibility and making this more accessible to more people. And then we also want to develop content specifically geared towards parents.
Yeah, and to expand on what Tiffany mentioned about in terms of the content that we have, so we have currently like a small but active community of mental health professionals that are creating both these interviews for us as well as curating some of our more academic language focused content. So we'd really like to expand that community a lot. So expand that community to people that are working in like the clinical field of this, the research phase of this. Any and all mental health professionals are, of course, welcome to give some of their input as well.
Sorry, go ahead.
That we also have a way for individuals that have lived some mental health experiences and want to talk about that to share the stories that they may have. And we have some of those already available on our website, but of course, we're always looking for more.
Yeah, I think that it's great that you're kind of focusing in on people who can relate with these stories or with these scenarios that people might be in. Especially, like, I feel like for me, if I read something that was, a little bit more South Asian focused, it would help me relate to that. And I know that they've gone through something similar and they can almost attest to what I'm trying to explain to them. So I think there's a certain level of comfort there, not only for like if I'm going through it, but also for my parents. Like, I think that'd be an interesting way to relay that information and almost explain why it's so important if it comes from someone in our own community. I just feel like that's the way that we've kind of grown up is if you're in the same community as us, like it's very easy for someone to talk to them and kind of relate to that information. So focusing on that, as I think it's brilliant. I think not a lot of organizations do that. So good job for you guys. I also think the stories is great. If anybody is watching, feel free to connect with them, whether you're a specialist, whether you're a professional, or you want to use a community to kind of relay your story as well. So feel free to go onto their website. It's listed right there for more information on that. Now, people might be watching this and be like, why are you only focusing on South Asians? Or, is it because it's easier to focus on them versus someone else? Kind of like playing the devil's advocate here. But, why don't you guys talk a little bit about why you're only focusing on South Asians through your nonprofit?
So I think I want to also make clear that neither mental illness nor the stigma around it are things that are exclusive to South Asian communities or South Asian American or Canadian communities. There are definitely a lot of lessons that people of other backgrounds can also take away from this as well. But I think what we want to focus on a very specific issue, which is the fact that the interactions that South Asians may have with mental health might be a little different from what other people may have. And that's both for maybe the cause for someone's mental illness, that it may be different for someone in a South Asian community than perhaps someone with a different background. And also the way that we may seek treatment or how we treat someone with a mental illness could also be different for South Asians as well as folks of other backgrounds.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, I mean, I'm probably stating the obvious, but Sid and I are both South Asian. And I think, like I said, we have our own lived experiences and we felt that we could best serve and help our own community that we're a part of. And then another thing that Sid and I did is we really looked into the research as we keep going back to, and there's actually a statistic that was recently published that said between the years 2011 and 2017, so about a 6-year period, Asian Americans who are aged 12 through 17, the amount of major depressive episodes that they have been diagnosed with has more than doubled. So I think that statistic may be misleading a little bit because it might just mean that more people are seeking out treatment and help, which is a good thing. But I think the main takeaway from that statistic is that it's not a problem that's going away. And we're seeing it more and more in youth. I mean, like I said, 12 to 17-year-olds. And so it's statistics like that that really, really makes us feel like South Asians specifically are a group that we need to talk about and highlight. And I think there's another statistic that also shows that South Asians are the least likely to seek treatment or help for a mental illness. And that is also something that we feel like needs to get addressed.
Yeah, I know we talked about this off camera, but there is a lack of studies that are also being done for South Asian communities. And I feel like, once we have more studies, we'll see more statistics like these that will hopefully allow us to, realize that it's such a big problem, and suppressing it away or hiding it in the corner is not going to make change happen. I feel like the more that we have open conversations and seeing these statistics, like the statistic that you just said, like that's ridiculous. Like that is a ridiculous high amount of number that people are, not addressing. And that's just the people who have addressed this. There could be so many, and there probably are, just knowing our culture, that go through the same thing and just don't feel comfortable enough to talk about it, or feel like, society will say this. And that's a huge thing where we're just sitting here and kind of suppressing all this in, whereas other communities are a little bit more open. So I feel like platforms like yourself kind of are the driving factors, to allow for change to happen. So I want to shift our focus into mental health in itself, where there's a little bit of a confusion between mental health and mental illness. So can you clarify that? I know that you guys aren't professionals and you could make mistakes, which is okay. But in your defense, like, what is that difference between mental health versus mental illness?
Okay, so I'm actually really happy that you asked this question. So I would say that if you're thinking about the difference between mental health and mental illness, just change the word mental to physical, right? So what is the difference between physical health and physical illness? So mental illness occurs when, say, a mental health professional will diagnose somebody with a condition, just like how a physical illness is when a physician or medical professional diagnoses someone with a physical condition. And unfortunately, you're right that there is some confusion between the two terms, where talking about mental health automatically equates to talking about mental illness, and someone considering their own mental health, they must only be doing that because they may have a mental illness, and that's just not the case, right? Everybody has some mental health. Not everybody may have a mental illness, but it's important to at least consider that, to get to the right point of, if someone does have a mental illness, then they should be treated for that.
Yeah, and I think another way to think about it maybe is with concrete examples. So the way I like to break it down is it's emotions versus a diagnosable illness. So all of us have had sad days, or where you're not feeling on top of your game, or maybe you're anxious about an upcoming exam. That is normal, and I think we're all human beings. We all experience emotions. But if you have consistent periods of anxiety, or you have symptoms that add up, and a mental health professional can diagnose you with generalized anxiety disorder or a major depressive episode, that is a little different than just being sad. So I think that's kind of the difference between mental health and then mental illness. But then Sid kind of touched on this, but we really like to talk about preventive care. So all of us as humans, we might eat well, or we might work out because we're trying to take care of our physical bodies. Or we might go to a checkup annually with a doctor. And that's kind of normal and ingrained in our culture. But I like to think about it, mental health is very similar. Like, you could go to therapy just as a preventative thing, or you could practice mindfulness daily to help you with your stress. And those are all ways we can think about mental wellness in a way that's maybe not as stigmatized.
Yeah, I think it's great that you guys are spinning it off in a way that's much more relatable to a lot of people. I think just having that distinction between, it's very similar to being like, I have a cough, maybe I should go to the doctor. Like, it's almost as easy as saying that. But I think the problem comes to where in our society, we don't consistently, kind of use the same thinking. So I think if more people start to think of it like that, versus just something that I have to go to a therapist, that means I'm weak and I have to now face the world. I think having that transition slowly into, I have a cough, and going to the doctor is very similar to, like you guys said. And I think it's great that you mentioned, practicing mindfulness and just taking preventative care for yourself. And especially in a time like this, where I know for the next 2 weeks, I'm in lockdown because my grandparents just came back. So for me, practicing, just 10 minutes of meditation, or practicing something that I like, all goes to feeding my mental health and overall well-being. So it's really easy for us as, the next generation to talk about these things, not so much for our parents. In your opinion, what is the best way for parents or, family members to address concerns that they might have about, changing emotions within their children, or, these signs or red flags that they may see?
Okay, so with just like any other, say, serious topic regarding their children, I think parents should approach this conversation with an open mind, right? And I think the important thing is throw away any like preconceived notions about how you think your child should feel, and really just listen to what is your child actually feeling. And it's also important to understand that situations which might make you happy or might make you feel like you're suffering may not necessarily be the same thing as what your child is facing, because you, of course, and this is especially true for, I feel like, a lot of South Asian parents who may have grown up in India or another South Asian country while their children are growing up in the United States or Canada or other non-South Asian countries, right? So there's differences in the experiences that are lived, and there's differences in what feelings might come from different experiences.
Yeah, and I think Sid alluded to this, but One PAL is unique because we are serving immigrants and we're serving people that may be first generation or second generation. So I think it's important for parents who have migrated from a South Asian country to acknowledge that there's not only a generational gap between you and your child, but there's also probably a pretty large cultural gap, and that's okay. And what your child is experiencing might not be what you experienced growing up, but that doesn't mean that their experiences aren't valid or of concern. So I think the first step is to acknowledge what your child is feeling and to give them validity and credit for their emotions. And then we also kind of mentioned this before, but I think the next step is to acknowledge that sometimes professional help may be needed, and that is no reflection on you as a parent. So just like you would take your child to the doctor if they have a cough, it may be perfectly okay and the right next step to take your child to a therapist if they are feeling anxious or depressed.
Yeah, I feel like, I've been doing a lot of reading, and a lot of different books about these things say that, the first step to kind of driving that change is to have open and honest conversations. And I feel like for us, that's really hard to do. But I feel like also if our parents kind of give us that support and kind of, like you said, validity for feeling what we're feeling, I feel like that will in itself drive change, just because that's one step closer to feeling comfortable and secure that it's okay to feel these emotions, and it's okay to, react a certain way and have really bad days or really good days. That still doesn't kind of solve the problem. Sometimes you're right, you do have to go get a professional to kind of use their knowledge, and they know best. I feel like sometimes we think that like we know better than doctors, or we know better than just going to and talking to someone about our feelings. It's like, hey, I can do that myself. Like, write it down in a book or something. But no, I feel like sometimes using the resources that we have, and I feel like living in a country like the United States or Canada, we're really lucky to have the resources that we do. And I feel like they're there for us to use, so why not use them? Kind of like extra help, like at school. Why would I not get extra help if I'm struggling with something? Like, it's okay. Sometimes that extra help is really all you need to make all your bad days into good days. So I know we kind of touched upon that, like we as South Asians kind of suppress our feelings, but like, why do you guys think that it is? Because I know you guys have done enough research. So why do you think we as a society suppress our feelings versus other societies where they're a little bit more comfortable and open with how they feel, and they're okay to voice kind of the illness or the fact that they're dealing with some type of mental health disorder?
Yeah, this is actually a great question. I think it's probably one of the first questions we get when we talk about stigma in South Asian cultures. So I'm glad you asked. But I think what the research says, and then also probably what all of us can attest to, is we as a South Asian community value collectivism over individualism. And that's kind of what makes us unique. And I think, and what that means is, like, in essence, we value a family group or a group dynamic over the individuals that make up that group. And that can be really, really awesome and really great in some scenarios. For example, we might push one another to achieve more, or we might be proud of one another, etc. But I think the drawbacks of having a collectivistic mindset is that you also tend to project shame onto an entire group. So if one person is suffering in that group, you then tend to, project that shame onto that entire group that person is part of. And I think that can be really, really harmful when we're talking about mental health. For example, if there is someone who is experiencing depression in a family, that's not a reflection of the family themselves. And we don't necessarily have to make it so hush-hush just because we are collectivistic.
Right. No, I feel like, you mentioned a little bit about collectivism, and I feel like as a society, we kind of project that onto the entire group versus it's just like a one-person thing. And I think, Sid, you can perfectly kind of sum up this entire situation with a line that, we hear a lot. So I don't know, take it away.
Yeah. Has anyone here ever heard the phrase "log kya kahenge," right? Which it's Hindi and it means "what will people say?"
I don't think anything can sum that up better. It's the fact that, like, hey, I do one thing and, all of a sudden it's on a WhatsApp group chat. And what are people going to think about what you just did? But I feel like kind of ending that stigma right there where, let people say whatever they want to say and just focus on yourself, because as soon as you put yourself first and, you're happy and satisfied with the person that you are and your family, you have that family support, which we're very lucky to have in most cases. But there are people who kind of don't have that. And I feel like, especially for those families, like, hear your child and listen to what they're saying, because it's only going to build up. And at a certain time, they're just going to kind of explode. And, organizations like yourself kind of reduce the instance of that happening. So I feel like that collectivism versus individualism perfectly sums up why we suppress our feelings in South Asian communities. So another thing I kind of want to talk about is I did a little bit of stalking on your pages. But when I looked you guys up, I came across this interview that you just did with a psychologist, and you spoke about spirituality versus mental health. Now, I know you guys aren't psychologists and you're just going to take the information that, you had in that interview. But for our viewers, can you elaborate on a little bit about how those two are related? Because I was really interested by the fact that, like, there's a certain correlation between the two.
Yeah, so I think spirituality is something that we may, as a South Asian community, actually be more comfortable with talking about, right?
Right.
And I think this brings us to another concept, which is that we seem to think now that mental health is some sort of a new concept. And it's actually not. And especially in South Asian communities, it's not, because a lot of the religious practices that South Asians engage in are actually rooted in mindfulness. So we've actually found some interesting parallels between even modern therapeutic practices and some things from even ancient Hindu texts, right? So one example of that is we found a pretty interesting parallel between dialectical behavioral therapy, which is one type of therapy that people can seek out, and between that and Vedanta, right, which is a ancient Indian I don't know how to describe it, like construct, and there's a stress on mindfulness in both, which mindfulness in this case means like observing an experience without actually becoming caught up in it, and also fully participating in the experience as well. And they both point at meditation as a guide to help achieve that mindfulness. And this is just one of a few other examples that we will actually be publishing on our website as well.
Yeah, no, I think it was when I was reading it and watching the interview, I thought it was so interesting that there was a parallel, and using these parallels and using this to explain to people who kind of could relate to that more than just the idea of it being new in itself could be a really good way to start those open and honest conversations. So it's almost as easy as, sending that to your grandpa on WhatsApp and, letting him explore what it is and, finding a way for them to relate to these things in an easier manner because they're much more familiar with something like spirituality. So I think that interview in itself is so great. For those of you who are watching who haven't seen that interview, it's on their website. So I highly recommend, finding that parallel and watching that information. So I know you guys are attached to a lot of different professionals, and it seems like you guys have done a handful of interviews. Are there any key learnings that you've gathered from these professionals that you might want to share with us, just because you guys are just the advocates and these people have a lot of good things to share?
Yeah, I think one thing that we've really learned throughout our interview series so far is therapy is very nuanced. So I think when people talk about, hey, I need to go to therapy, you think of like the stereotypical movie scene where you're laying on a couch, you're closing your eyes, you're free associating, and your therapist is writing notes. Right. While that is one branch of therapy, there's actually many different forms of therapy. And as an individual, you should really do your research and figure out which one might serve your needs best and which one matches, I guess, your lifestyle and your personality best. Right. So that's one thing that we talk about in our interviews, which I encourage everyone to watch. Another thing that we also talked about is therapy doesn't have to be something you seek out in a crisis. So it could just be preventative, like we've talked about. You might just be having a stressful month at work and you want to talk it out with a professional. That is totally normal and totally encouraged. Another example, we talked to a family and marriage therapist, and they said that they see a wide range of patients that just bring in their kids who might be fighting a lot. So there's lots of different benefits to seeking out therapy, and I think we talk about it as this big taboo thing when it's really very nuanced. Another thing about therapy, which we are going to have resources up soon about this, is figuring out how to find a therapist that matches you is really crucial. So like, while that might be a cultural fit, we have South Asian providers out there. It might also just be someone who understands the age range that you're in. You might have someone that specializes in teenagers versus adults, etc. So I think there's a lot to seeking out help that we don't really talk about because it's so taboo, just in general.
Yeah, I think seeking out, like, starting with, finding the right therapist and, acknowledging that you might have problems that aren't necessarily like normal or whatever people say. And, fighting that norm where I can go and get help is really the first step. So I know we talked a little bit about like our society and why you guys focus primarily on South Asian the South Asian community, but sometimes it's really hard to get these people to change. Like, I know it's just something about them that they won't change and they don't want to change. So how do you guys feel like growing up in America? How is that change going to happen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Honestly, Sid and I have this debate all the time where we're like, is what we're doing really going to change anything?
Yeah.
But I think what we always come back to is that it just takes a couple actions or a couple steps or a couple people to buy into the idea, and then you'll start spreading change more and more. And so I think just giving weight to these conversations in any light is really important. So like even this interview and your organization, thank you so much for highlighting this and giving us a space to talk about mental health. And then another thing that I think is really great and has been promising is we keep seeing more and more nonprofits. So like Sid and I have mentioned a couple that we researched, but there are more and more organizations specifically for South Asians or mental health, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I think when we'll see a change is when this kind of conversation that we're having right now, it just becomes a mainstream concept. It's not like a niche anymore. And I've noticed that we do start to have these conversations a little bit. And, even very recently, after the death of, there was a Bollywood actor, Sushant Singh Rajput, who took his own life. And there was some conversation that I did see going around either on social media or even like news panels and things like that. But even that has sort of started to disappear as like we start focusing on something else, right? And I think we'll start to see a change when this conversation no longer is just catalyzed by someone it shouldn't take a suicide to start this conversation.
Yeah, I was gonna say like something bad has to happen and then we start talking about it. Just doesn't sit right.
Yeah, and after it shouldn't disappear either, right? Like this is something that we want people to like. I think we keep drawing back to physical health, but there is a lot of focus on people, right? Like they consider their physical health on like a very regular basis, but we'd love to see if people would focus on their mental health as well.
I also think like something that is really important to me is meeting people where they are. I did want to emphasize, like, not everyone is ready to seek out therapy. Medication might not be the answer for everyone. You might not even be willing to openly talk about your struggles yet. And I think that's totally normal. But I think we can all do our little part. So for example, being conscious of the language we use around mental health might be something that each and every one of us can, start doing tomorrow. Some examples of that is if you're starting to value academic performance over mental health, like that is toxic. If you are going to shame other people that are seeking out therapy, that's not good. You're going to perpetuate stigma in that sense.
Yeah.
Even saying things like "what will people think" is in its own way perpetuating stigma. So I think there are little things that each and every single one of us can do daily to do our part.
Yeah, I think you guys hit the spot with the fact that like starting organizations like these and having these mindful conversations will create some sort of like domino or ripple effect where all it really takes is that one moment. Don't come at me, it's yours. Like I'm serious, it's yours. But that one moment or that one pull that kind of transitions into driving that change. And I think you guys are right, where the fact that like it's okay if you aren't where the books say you need to be in order to seek therapy. Like everybody has kind of their own journey, I think. And same goes for like I've seen so many different cancer patients who don't exactly have the same journey. They're at all different stages, but they know their bodies best. And I think that like that's something that we can also apply to these conversations where we know our bodies best. And sometimes what we see in our face isn't exactly what's going on in our brain. So I think it's great that you guys are talking about having people being comfortable in a sense where they know what position they're in and kind of moving forward from there, and being mindful of the language that people use is, I think, also really great. I know before we started talking about this, I was talking to my mom and I'm like, I really hope I don't say the wrong thing, just because people kind of use that and that's where change stops. So I feel like if you kind of have these open conversations and be kind of aware of what you're talking about and how you're talking about it, I think a driving factor in itself. So I want to kind of talk about a little bit of the resources that you guys do have, because that's a huge part of your organization, just relaying that information. So where can our viewers access what you have on your platform?
Right. So our website is a great starting point. That's where we have a lot of our long form content, like our articles and our full interviews that we have with professionals, as well as stories, tools for parents. And eventually, we're still in the pretty early stages right now, but eventually we'll also bring in some translated content as well. And that's just at onepal.org.
Okay.
We also have our Facebook and our Instagram. So our Facebook is just One Pal if you search it. And then our Instagram, which I see is on the screen, is One Pal, One Moment. And that is a really great platform because it's where we can connect with each one of you. So if you DM us, we'll definitely respond to every message we get. And then also we have snippets of our content. So if you're not really sure where to go on our site, we highlight different pieces on our Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah. I've seen their Instagram. It's definitely really, really easy to access the information from there. There's a lot of really good stories that are also on your website. So I think that's an awesome point as well. Now, okay, here's the other thing that I wanted to talk about is you mentioned that there's so many nonprofits that do similar things to you guys. What kind of information is available on your website that's kind of different from the other websites?
Yeah, so we focus on three sections, right? So we have education, we have stories, and we have parents. So one way that we differ from, say, other education platforms is that we focus on South Asian Americans and, by proxy, also South Asian Canadians.
Thanks.
We're also more, I'd say we're science focused. We want everything that we have on our website to be based in something that, basically someone smarter than me has actually observed and therefore can speak to it with more backing behind it.
And for those of you watching, that smart person is really smart, because that guy right there is also incredibly smart.
Thank you. We also would like to make like our academic research more easily available. And this is something which I think is just, we don't want to editorialize our own academic research or the work of actual professionals.
Right.
But we do want to make it more accessible because, of course, they're writing for their peers who are other researchers, and we want to bring that content to, say, a more mainstream audience. And then lastly, what we also saw was another big gap is that, of course, a lot of this content that does exist exists in English. And we also understand that while that's my first language, it may not be everyone else's first language, especially parents who did not grow up in the United States or Canada. So we would like to be able to translate that to other South Asian languages as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you say that, like, it's really easy for us to read our first language, but not so much in the people that we want, whose mindset we kind of want to change. So I think using the research that you get and translating that into languages that are much more familiar with these people is a great way to go about this. Now, I know I talked about stories already, but that was such a cool part that I saw in terms of your website in itself. So can you talk a little bit about the stories section in itself?
Yeah, sure. And I'd like to mention that there's actually, so that's one way that folks can contribute to our initiative. So there's a few other ways as well. So like I mentioned before, we're also actively seeking professionals in the mental health space. So again, whether they're therapists, like clinical psychiatrists, academic researchers, we'd love for more professionals to help us produce and curate our content. And we also have a space for stories. So if people would like to tell a story that they've experienced with mental health, because one of our big goals is to let people know that, hey, they're not alone, right? Other people have been through similar things, and there is, say, light at the end of the tunnel, right? If you would like to share a story, then you can do that through our website, and of course you can consume other people's stories as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad that you actually chose to highlight the stories section, because even though we are so research and academic and science focused, we do want to humanize mental health, because that's obviously a big part of it, is that we all experience it, and we want to share these experiences that people have in our community to show that, one, you're not alone, and two, we are openly talking about it and it's normal. So as Sid said, go on our website and you can consume the stories, and there's also a link to submit. We are also offering the ability to post your story anonymously, because like I said, not everyone might be ready to share publicly, but that's totally okay.
Right. Yeah, no, I feel like one thing that was like I was so attracted to was the stories platform. And I feel like that just goes to building a community and, you know, fostering this comfort level between people who are experiencing very similar things. So I think just building that community is also the first step to kind of driving that change, like I keep saying. But I just feel like once we're strong enough as a community to tackle these things, if there's 10 or 20 people left who are still kind of unable to change their thinking, I feel like that's enough power to kind of drive that change as well. So the story section is great. I read a couple myself, and just reading other people's stories kind of gives you power as well. So I think that's also great. For those of you who are interested in, you know, reading more about South Asian communities and mental health, the Canadian Association of Mental Health just recently published this story or this article. They've done a kind of an intervention on South Asian immigrants in Canada. So I think if this is something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend reading that. I think some of the statistics and data that they have in there is shocking, to say the least. So feel free. I will add that once this is posted for a direct link to that. This is kind of all the time that we have here. That was great. I loved our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. It isn't easy to talk about things like this, especially if you're not from that background. So kudos to you guys for, you know, just standing your ground and just being really strong about the message that you're trying to advocate for. So great job on that. This will be posted for those of you who kind of want to share this with other people or rewatch it for any information that they said, or just the message in itself. So this will be posted right after we are off our live page. So again, both of you guys, thank you so much. I wish you guys nothing but the best with your organization moving forward. And everybody who is watching, if you do know someone as a professional, just kind of shout their name out to them if they kind of want to be interested in that, as well as follow them on their social media pages. And happy in advance Canada Day to my country, but also to you guys, happy early 4th of July. Be safe, wear your masks, just practice good social distancing just because it isn't over yet. But thank you, and I will see you guys next week. Be sure to watch our other Empowered episode on Thursday.
Thank you.